Welcome to the CHCI Leadership Conference panel session on Keeping Our Communities Safe, a conversation on gun safety. This session is possible due to the gracious contributions from our sponsors, Everytown and Giffords Law Center. Our moderator for this panel discussion will be Mark Morales of CNN. Our panel chair is Representative Chuy Garcia, who represents the 4th Congressional District in Illinois. He currently serves as a member of the influential Financial Services Committee, Natural Resources Committee, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. We are pleased to welcome Representative Garcia to begin our program.
My name is Chuy Garcia, and I represent Illinois' 4th Congressional District. I represent the only Latino majority district in the Midwest, which includes the north and southwest sides of Chicago and some of the city's western suburbs. And as you know, we're no strangers to gun violence in Chicagoland. I've lived in my neighborhood for over 40 years, and sadly, in that time, we've mourned countless victims of gun violence. People's sons, daughters, cousins, and friends. This has to stop. To understand street violence, we need to take a critical role at historical patterns that continue today, like disinvestment from Latino and Black communities, school closures that rob young people of educational opportunities. Redlining has meant less housing stability. Good jobs are almost always located away from workers' homes, and there are no robust transit options for them. The list goes on. If we're going to tackle the gun violence issue in Chicago and in other large urban areas, we need a comprehensive approach that addresses the root causes of suffering in our communities. There's no one-stop solution. Political sound bites about getting tough on crime aren't going to solve this. But my neighborhood can't wait. We can't lose more lives to senseless violence. We need to invest in our communities on many fronts, including housing, education, and career opportunities. That's why I introduced the Connecting Youth to Jobs Act. My bill guarantees subsidized job opportunities for youth facing barriers to employment and supports wraparound services like transportation and childcare that youth may need to keep those jobs. That's why we're working on transformative police reform. As chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus's Racial Justice Task Force, I led my colleagues in suggesting police reforms that could be particularly impactful to the Latino community. And of course, that's why I strongly support common sense gun reform legislation like H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446. Preventing guns from reaching the streets is an important, tangible part of much bigger solutions of community change and transformative reinvestment. So thanks for having me on the panel today, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Morales, and I am a reporter here at CNN. I cover crime and law enforcement. I'm pleased to be here today during Hispanic Heritage Month and to engage a great panel of experts on the topic of keeping our community safe, a conversation on gun violence. As we begin, I'd like to thank Congressman Chuy Garcia for his opening remarks and for serving as a chair for this session. I'd like to read a couple of statistics to you just to sort of set the table as to what we're looking at here. And these are all numbers according to the Gun Violence Archive that says that we're headed for one of the worst years as far as gun violence is in decades. From the period about January 1st to September 15th, we're looking at over 14,000 people who have died in the United States. That's going to be 1,300 more than last year over the same time period. Mass shootings are up. So far this year, there's been just under 500, and that's on pace to be 15% higher at the end of the year. Now, what numbers I haven't mentioned is how they've affected the Latino community and what challenges that brings apart, and that's what our esteemed panel here is going to talk about and how we're really going to figure out exactly what's going on here. I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions during the discussion, please type it into the chat, and we'll have some time allotted near the end to answer as many of them as we can. And like I said, to explore this topic, we have a panel of 3 experts who are involved in various aspects who work on gun violence. And first, I'd like to welcome Jose Alfaro, who is with Everytown for Gun Safety. Jose?
I use he, him, his, el pronouns, and I'm the Director of Latinx Leadership and Community Engagement at Everytown for Gun Safety. A lot of my work is really to engage Latinx communities and build power so that we can pass gun sense legislation across the United States. Thanks for having me.
Our next panelist is Paul Carrillo, who is with the Gifford. Paul?
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Carrillo. I'm the director of the Community Violence Initiative at Giffords Law Center. What my team does at Giffords is we support the field of community violence intervention across the nation, predominantly Black and brown, homegrown peacemakers, credible messengers, community activists who are working every day to save lives of their children, their neighbors, loved ones, etc., to prevent gun violence. And happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Our third panelist is Kelly Simpson with the Brady Center.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Sampson, and I am Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice at Brady. So what that means for me is I spend some of my time working to take on the gun industry in litigation, and the other part of my time I spend working across Brady to make sure that everything that we're doing in Congress, courts, and communities has a racial justice focus so that we can make sure that gun violence, and especially gun homicide, which has a disproportionate impact on Black and brown people, is seen through that lens and addressed as the racial justice issue that it is. And I'm super honored to be here and excited to talk about this topic.
Thank you so much, everyone. As we begin, I want to invite each panelist to make a brief opening remark on our topic, and then we'll spend the rest of the time in discussion together. So, Jose, would you kick off?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I think about the number 3,800 Latinx lives lost to gun violence on a yearly basis. I think about gun homicides in our communities all across the United States. I think about gun suicides that are often things that we don't talk about. And I also think about all of the information that we still don't know. There's a lot of information that would allow us to get a better picture of the ways that gun violence impact Latinx communities, and thinking about the ways in which Latinx communities can be more involved and engaged in this movement. And so I'm absolutely humbled and honored to be here to really think about those solutions, to be able to bring more Latinos into these spaces.
Thank you very much, Jose. Paul, any thoughts from you?
Yes, what's most important to me, I think, is that, historically there's been a lack of investment in, models, approaches, efforts in Latino communities, Black and brown communities, with folks that every day risk their lives and do what they can morally, ethically, legally to save lives of folks in their communities. But it's difficult for two main reasons. There's various reasons, but the two main reasons for me, in my opinion, are: number one is a lack of investment from our elected officials to invest in these efforts. I can compare them to kind of like a startup business that has just been waiting 20, 30, 40, 50 years for that large financer or bank to come in and invest, and so that services can be scaled up. The other thing is the profound access to firearms, which obviously is a significant issue in this country.
Thanks so much, Paul. Kelly, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'd actually like to pick up on something Paul mentioned, which is access to a firearm. Because one of the things that we know is that gun homicide, while it has a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities, the gun industry, which is profiting from gun sales and also responsible for allowing gun sales to come into these communities, basically gets a free pass in a lot of ways. And one of those ways is that there has been a purposeful effort by the gun lobby to make sure that the ATF and other organizations that are responsible for regulating the gun industry do not have the resources that they need. And so when we think about gun crime, so often we think about people who are Black and brown, and we ignore all of the irresponsible conduct that happens on the industry that largely is largely a white industry. And so one of the things that we've been thinking a lot, Brady, is how can we make sure that we are actually stopping gun violence before it starts? And a lot of that has to do with investing in communities. And the other part of that has to do with investing in making sure that we're monitoring the industry so that these gun sellers aren't allowed to allow guns to come into communities.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad to be speaking with you guys and just getting an idea and a sense as to where you folks are. So I wanted to throw out as a first question, I think you all somewhat touched on this, is the prevalence of firearms. I know in New York City, the numbers of gun violence, of victims, of people that have been shot, of actual shootings has gone up. It's gone up, and in other major cities as well. So from you folks, you have your ears to the ground. What would you say has been the top two, top three, or number one issue that has caused all this gun violence to spike? In your opinion, is it more prevalence of more guns? Has it been many things? Like where would you put it on?
I'll jump in. So I think, issues in our communities are complex, right? But it's interesting to me when I hear experts and even the media asking, why is violence up in the South Bronx? Why is violence up in South Central Los Angeles? Why is it up? And then, but if you really take a look back, like, they're traditionally the same communities that have always had high levels of violence, right? In addition to that, during COVID, and we're still in the midst of COVID, the areas and communities that had the highest death rates due to COVID and highest infection rates are the same poor communities where there's high levels of gun violence. So it's just a sad, unfortunate same song of disenfranchised communities that bear the brunt of pretty much any issue that takes place in our society. And so for me, it's connecting to that is generational trauma, right? So these communities are still poor. There's still a lack of employment opportunities. There's still significant racism. There's still residual effects of redlining. So it's not really a surprise to me, right? It's not as if we've changed these communities drastically and they've been totally transformed for 100 years, and then violence goes up and we're all saying, why is it going back up? To me, it's obvious. It's not that hard to figure out to me.
Jose, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think a part of this is really looking at all of the systemic barriers to access aid for resources in our communities, thinking about the historical context of why our communities are the way that they are. I think Paul hit the nail right on the head, is essentially that we are disenfranchised communities. We are communities that face systemic racism over the course of, generations and centuries. And also, there are ways that we can fight back, right? There is legislation right now that we can get passed through Congress that'll allow for some of these community intervention programs to really continue to do the life-saving work that they're doing, and also expand on their work, because we know that it works, right? And so the Break the Cycle Act is one of those propositions that we're really excited about, and also really thinking about the $50 billion investment from the Biden administration to expand into community intervention programs that we think will allow for our communities to get the resources that they need in order to save more lives.
And Kelly, how about you? What do you think?
I also wholeheartedly agree with what Jose and Paul said. And I think, to Paul's point about the complexity of issues and how they're interconnected, we can't separate what's been going on in terms of gun violence over the past year and a half from the pandemic, and from the ways that the pandemic has really come down on people and made it so much more difficult for people to live, to provide for themselves. Obviously, I think the pandemic has really exposed how some people who don't have the privilege of working from home, or who don't have the privilege of being able to protect themselves, have had a really desperate time. And I think that you can't disconnect those things. And for that reason, while the answer to why has gun violence seemed to increase over the past year and a half has many factors. I think one factor that we can immediately dismiss is this idea that some people have tried to say, well, obviously it's because in 2020 there were protests about police violence and that's why crime went up. And I think that we can say that that is not why, that there are a whole host of issues. And so I totally agree that part of the complexity of issues that have been leading to these problems are why we need to think holistically about what we can do to resolve gun violence and resist any urges to go back towards a sort of tough on crime approach, because that doesn't really work. And in a lot of cases, it can just create more root causes that lead to more violence. So we do have to think holistically about investing in communities, investing in people who are close to their communities and doing the work, and thinking about cutting off the sources of guns into communities rather than just going back to, well, let's mass incarcerate everyone and that'll do the trick, because it won't.
Kelly, you brought up something very interesting, the whole idea of getting tougher on crime. That's certainly something that I think is the initial jump that a lot of people have been referring to, at least here in New York. We're going to be changing mayors, and there's going to be a lot of people leaving positions, and there's going to be a new police commissioner, a new district attorney from Manhattan, just in a few short months from now. So, and I know the knee-jerk reaction, much like you said, is going to be we need to be tougher on crime, but I'd like for you to expand a little bit on that more, if you could, because at least here in New York, that's what happened when Mayor Giuliani took over. That became sort of the idea. Let's be tougher on crime. But if you could, and obviously for everybody else too, but expand on why that might not be the best course of action.
There's so many factors. I mean, one sort of in a just looking at the issue from 30,000 feet is the way that we define crime is racialized. And so a lot of times people will racialize crime and think, well, it has to do with conduct that Black and Latino people do, and not necessarily think about, well, what does crime look like when it's happening on Wall Street? Or what does crime look like if it's happening at a gun store, And so I think we first have to step back and think about what do we mean by that. But then in terms of how it intersects with gun violence and why a tough on crime approach won't necessarily be helpful, there are so many reasons. One of them is that there's been a significant amount of research about the impact that mass incarceration has on communities, and how when you start to take people out of communities, and then when they come back into the communities, you put a scarlet letter on them, F for felon, meaning that they can't really be able to live their full lives. It can lead people to desperation. It can create more root causes for gun violence and tear at those community level ties that keep violence from happening. So that's one issue with a tough on crime approach. Another is that it doesn't necessarily stop crime before it starts. And I think that's one thing that, whether you're talking about a community violence interruption model or some of what we work on at Brady, which is getting at crime guns and stopping gun trafficking, there are things we can do that aren't going to be just coming in with a hammer, but really coming in with a scalpel and thinking about how can we stop gun violence before it starts, that we can save people's lives and we can stop people from getting shot in the first place, which is, I think, the ultimate goal when we're talking about preventing gun violence. So I can stop there, but I'll just stop there.
Paul, what do you think?
No, one particular part of it is, I mean, there's a lot of residual effects, right? It becomes very expensive. Obviously, I think we saw that in California. Then when you had, large, rich people turned it into a business, right? You had prisons that were a business, and folks were making money off of Black and brown folks being incarcerated for 300 years, 250 years, etc. The other thing is it's now, don't get me wrong, if somebody commits a heinous crime against my family, my kids, I expect that person to be brought to justice, right? But sometimes tough on crime means that it gives some in law enforcement free reign to do whatever they want to whoever they want, however, whenever. And then you're talking about destroying trust between police and community, right? And then there can't be trust and there can't be safety. And if, in a community, if the residents don't trust law enforcement, right? And there's just so many layers. The other part of it on the back end is that we do a terrible job across the nation. And there's a couple of states that do a better job than others, but we do a terrible job at helping folks rehabilitate, right? Whatever that means. It means something different to some and than to others. And then so to Kelly's point, where folks are getting out and they got no shot. Like everything is against them, right? There really is no rehabilitation. It's just kind of. I remember in California, I don't know if it's still the case. It was like, here's $200 at the gate, find your way home, and that's it. And then the Greyhound ride home might be $185. So now you got $15 left. So it's multi-layered. It's a business, and tough on crime has not worked. Pretty anywhere that you show me that law enforcement has been extremely tough on crime, like heavy-handed, then I can show you where there's a lack of community trust and folks won't even call the police for help.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think about police violence as gun violence, right? Like police violence really impacting communities in ways that disproportionately affect Black and Brown people. I think about Adam Toledo in Chicago, a young 14-year-old boy who was shot and killed by a police officer. And that community still hasn't seen justice. That community is still in mourning. That community still has to live with the fact that they no longer get to see their child. And so Latinos are impacted by police violence and police shootings at disproportionate rates as well. And it becomes a little complicated as well, right? Because at times we don't think about police officers. We don't all think about police officers in the same way in Latinx communities. Depending on the country that somebody comes from, they may have a different view on police violence, police corruption, or their trust with police officers. And so, to Paul's point, really breaking that trust in some of these communities doesn't allow for us to protect the most marginalized as well, being trans folks, women, undocumented people, particularly when they're at greater risk for being deported, they're at greater risk for being shot, or are at greater risk of being abused. And so, when I think about tough on crime, I think about the expansion of gun violence through police violence.
That's a really interesting point, and I know over the last few years we've been seeing, whether it's police body cam footage or surveillance footage of uh, incidents of police being involved in situations where somebody gets shot, and that causing a lot of anger. And you bring up an interesting point, and I guess police are always talking about how their relationship with the community is one of the major things that, Kelly, to your point, is supposed to head off violence before it happens. So I was hoping maybe you guys could all expand on the idea of how much is that working in what you've seen, or is it not working, or is there a lack of ability, or whether or not that's actually even happened in a lot of cities. Just that relationship between community and police and how it relates to gun violence.
I'll
I
jump
think
in. Go ahead, Jose.
after you, please.
Um, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, I have friends in law enforcement, right? And there's some beautiful, hardworking, dedicated men and women in law enforcement, and so I just want to say that first, right? But I also come from a gang family in South LA, out of Watts, and have had pretty bad experiences with police. Police officer, same police officer arrested my dad, my mother, myself, my brother, all at different times. Sometimes maybe warranted, other times absolutely not warranted, right? So I can kind of be on both sides, but I like to be an optimist. But I would compare. We have a project in LA with LAPD called the Community Safety Partnership, and essentially what it does is, like, the officers, to be placed in the Community Safety Partnership, it's a promotion. So it's not a demotion like in other times. It's like, oh, we're going to put these guys over here in the rough neighborhood. They're going to have to earn their stripes. No, this is actually a promotion. So you have more officers than usual wanting to be a part of this effort. And then the community is part of the interview process to select these officers. And then they're required to be on foot, walking the community, talking to people, I think at least 70% of the time. They can't just sit in the patrol car and not talk to folks, right? And so Imara Tingarides, was really like, I mean, the leader of that effort for LAPD in Watts, and was recently promoted. It was one of the best things that I think that the mayor in LAPD could have done in LA, is promoted her to chief, deputy chief of community safety partnership, and made it an actual bureau. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfect, but one of the things, as an example, is and it all depends on the person, right? Because you could have a great model, a great approach, but who are the people that are interacting and that are implementing this effort? But one of the things that happened with the community safety partnership is, after a couple of years, for example, of Imana being in Watts, the community loved her, and so just calls to law enforcement for support and even information to solve crimes like tripled. So that's just an example of, like, if you have like the right approach, the right leader, and it's a part, has to be a partnership between community and law enforcement.
Jose, what do you think?
Yeah, and I was definitely just gonna say it varies from community to community. I think there are some communities like what Paul's talking about, that have deeper relationships, and in other communities they don't. And I think some of the things that I think about is, look, Latinx folks are everywhere. We're in all 50 states. We may be smaller populations in some spaces and larger populations in other spaces, but there are still communities right now who are being engaged by police officers without a cultural understanding of who our people are, right? I think about our people in Wyoming. I think about our people in Idaho. I think about our people throughout, some of the rural parts of the Midwest. And, there are relationships that have yet to be built. There are stereotypes about our communities. There are fears based on, generations of systemic and social racism that really impact the ways that our communities are being interacted with police officers. And so, in order for there to be a better relationship, I think this has to be a national effort to really think about the ways in which we're engaging communities to be a part of these conversations.
Kelly, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thought I have and one disclaimer is I'm coming to this particular conversation as an ally to the Latino community. I am not a member of the community, so I don't have firsthand knowledge about what it looks like in DC, for example, in relationships with policing. But I think in general, one thing I would add is that a lot of times in communities when there's a lack of trust in policing, that can also lead people to feeling like they need to sort of take matters into their own hands to keep themselves safe. So I think the more that we have effective solutions, and that we start to think about our budgets, for example, and where can we put money and resources and programs that are going to be effective. And maybe it doesn't look like the traditional model, like Paul was saying. But if it's effective, I think that'll boost things up more and more. Because as a member of a community, if you realize I'm on my own here, if I call, I'm not going to get any help. If something happens to my family member, we're never gonna find out who did it. It doesn't really go a long way to engendering trust. And so I think that that's where law enforcement agencies around the country would be well served to think creatively about preventing gun violence, and also think about how are you defining crime. And I keep coming back to that point because you think about, obviously, assaults or murders and things of that nature. But we also have a set of gun laws that regulate the sale of guns and the marketing of guns. And when those laws are broken, those are crimes too. And I think if officers and if law enforcement agencies would be thinking, when it comes to gun crime, it's not just about the moment someone gets a gun. It's also about the moment someone allows a gun to be stolen or go missing, when they know good and well they've allowed a trafficker to get it. And thinking about it that way, I think, could also help communities to realize that, or not just realize, it would actually be protecting communities to think about crime as it relates to gun violence much more holistically, because the old model hasn't really been working. And we know that, and the statistics bear it out. And so I think that that is a huge way to kind of build that trust up.
Kelly, I heard what you were saying, and it reminded me a lot about here in New York, the discussions about the iron pipeline, which is different cities where it's much easier to get a gun, like Georgia or Virginia, and those guns are brought in over the roadways or however into major cities and they find themselves out in New York. How much of a problem is it that those pipelines, that iron pipeline, is still really functioning, and there hasn't been much to stop that? Kelly.
It's a huge problem. To put it mildly, I mean, for example, Chicago is a city that infamously has no gun stores in the city. All the gun stores around Chicago are outside of the city, they're in the suburbs. And yet, Chicago is a city that has a ton of gun crime, and that happens for a reason. It goes to show that you can have an area that has very strong gun laws, but if the surrounding areas do not, then it's going to be really easy for those guns to kind of cross city borders, cross city limits, etc. And I think COVID is a good analogy to help people understand that. If you think about it, we saw very different reactions to the pandemic depending on the jurisdiction that you were in and depending on who was in charge. But because we're a nation and we're connected, you can't have an island. You can't have a place that says, we're going to do everything we can to tackle this disease if your neighbors, even across the country, are not, because it will spread to you. And gun violence is a public health issue and acts the same way. So it's a huge issue that we don't have a national approach to gun violence, and we don't have a national approach to controlling the spread of illegal guns. And so that's a big issue, and that goes to some of the bills that are before Congress and more specifically before the Senate right now.
Paul, what do you think?
Well, I agree, but and the way I look at it is it boils down to two things. One is how and why our people get to a point where they feel and believe that the only way for them to resolve conflict is to use a weapon or to resort to violence. That's one part of it. The other side of it is access to firearms, right? So then when you have both, that's when you have high levels of crime. And then you start unpacking both, then you start to see a lot of racism, a lot of institutionalized systemic stuff that has affected our people for a long time. So I think the three of us and our organizations and others are working to try to prevent what is happening in real time on the ground right now, but then also long term to undo a lot of what has been done to people of color for hundreds of years in this country.
Jose, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with everything that everybody said. I think the one thing I also think about is there was a recent article that showed up that there was a gun owner in, I think it was Wisconsin, may have lost his gun or, his gun was stolen and then was linked to about like 10 homicides, in Chicago. And I think about how guns can often be handed down from person to person. One doesn't we don't have great ways to track some of these either purchases, whatever you want to call them, and that's also a big problem as well.
And Jose, when you spoke earlier, I took some notes down because what you said, it just stuck out in my mind. You said about policing culturally, they don't understand who we are. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit more about that and just how much of an issue that becomes.
Yeah. I gave a couple of examples about, some of these places like Wyoming, Idaho. There's very little context for some of our communities, and in a lot of these communities, you also have marginalized communities within marginalized communities. So you have indigenous communities that don't speak Spanish, and so there can also be assumptions about these communities without fully understanding both the context under which they arrived or are here. And also some of the cultural nuances of those particular communities, right? And so when we think about places like Los Angeles, Texas, Arizona, we think heavy Chicano, heavy Chicanekese cultures, and by and large, like you also have some folks that are members of the law enforcement who also identify as Latino, Latina, and have different relationships with our communities. But then you also have folks that don't know anything about our communities at all, make assumptions, or the only understanding of our communities that they have are through the media that they're consuming, or through some of these racialized tropes and stereotypes. And also, you hear about places like Central America that, particularly El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, where a lot of migrants have been fleeing violence, both, through gang violence, but also gun violence. And there are a lot of assumptions about our people that allow for people to create policies and also dehumanize our communities in ways that allow for this police violence to happen.
Well, your thoughts?
Um, I agree. It seems like we all agree with each other on everything, which is great. I want to add something that's very important. I don't think any of us have said yet. Is that another thing that really hurts our people as Latinos? I say brown people is the whole thing, especially during the last administration, of like not trusting authorities, right? Government workers, police, law enforcement, whatever, because out of fear of immigration status, right? And so crimes will be committed. Folks won't call the police because they're like, well, are they going to come? And then now my whole family's sitting on the curb and they're running their residency or their citizenship status or whatnot. So that's another problem for our communities. And I would say that there's some examples I've seen of law enforcement agencies that really work hard to build bridges with folks and let folks know, like, that's ICE. We're not working with ICE. That's not our goal. We're here to protect you, to serve you. And then there's other police departments who I would say welcome the fact that at least it feels that way, that brown folks are being suffer from crimes and aren't calling, and they could care less. So that's another big problem, I think, for our people.
Kelly, what do you think?
I don't really have much to add to what Paul and Jose said.
Yeah, I'll also say, with regard to the immigration component, there are, in some states, in some cities, there are mandates to report, right? Some police officers are mandated to work with CBP, Border Patrol, and Protection, and so that also deteriorates some of the trust that well-intentioned folks are trying to build in community as well.
Paul, as you were mentioning that, I thought about, I used to cover crime on Long Island, and they had an issue with MS-13 out there. And one of the issues was people were not coming forward or not engaging with police because they were afraid. And I talked to a community organizer out there, and the phrase that I remember to this day for saying is, they don't want to be mixed up because they look like the very people that the police think they're looking for. So I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to ask the entire panel, what are some ways that bridge that gap so that people are not afraid to come forward with information or with anything that might head off violence before it even happens?
Yeah, I see that time is winding down for us, and that's could be a long discussion. I'll say this. I
think we need another hour here.
Yeah. I worked as a consultant with USAID in El Salvador for 3 years, up until 2020. And I'll give you an example. You talk about police mistrust and police use of force and police violence. One individual who I still communicate with today, the police raided his house in El Salvador, arrested him, raped his girlfriend, and then took her to jail as well, right? So so people are coming here for a better life, but they're also bringing that trauma, right? Just because you're in a new country, you're not necessarily going to see someone else in uniform and not think, like, are they going to do the same thing to me here that happened to me in my home country? In regards to the solution, I always, the short, easy answer, because of time, I would say it's just a one-on-one, be genuine, be empathetic. One thing about Black and brown folks is we could tell when somebody's BSing us. It takes us 10 seconds and we already know if you want something from us or you're genuine, right? One person at a time, and genuine empathy will go a long way. And patience, right? Our people carry a lot of trauma, so folks got to be patient with us.
Jose, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, as Paul's talking, I'm also thinking about alternative dispatch, right? Like, what does it mean to have culturally relevant resources being delivered to our communities because we have so much trauma, because there's so much need. Sometimes our basic needs aren't met and we're on survival mode. And that also impacts the way that we make decisions. It impacts the ways that we react to things and people, to stimulus. And so I really think about, this is a much larger question in terms of building trust, but I also think, these institutions, it's their obligation to start delivering the resources that are needed in our communities in order for us to both live whole and healthy lives and then to trust as well.
And Kelly, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, just continuing the theme of agreement, I completely agree with what Jose and Paul have said. And one thing I would add is to hold officers accountable when they act improperly. I mean, we have a huge problem in this country of officers being able to act with impunity and being then protected by all levels of the system from that behavior. And that does nothing to make anyone feel like, well, I can go here and I'll be treated well. And if I'm not, there will be accountability. And so I think taking it above the notch of an individual officer, the systems as a whole, the agencies as a whole, actually holding officers accountable. And if they fail to do that, then Congress and legislatures in the states need to reform the laws and reform the policies around review so that they have no choice but to hold officers accountable. Because I think as long as we as citizens and we as residents are getting the message that officers are above the law, that really is not going to be helpful for anyone feeling like I can then go and feel like I can trust these systems to protect me and my family.
Now, we've got some questions from the audience who've been watching, so I just wanted to get your thoughts, and we're going to take some questions from them. First up, what are some specific things that someone who wants to help reduce gun violence can do to make a positive difference on this issue? Jose, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think there are numerous ways to get involved. You can get involved locally. You can get involved, at the state level. You can also get involved at the national level. At the local level, it's looking at who's doing the organizing work, who's on the ground, who's engaging. Are you willing to volunteer your time to a community violence interruption group? Are you willing to donate to some of these organizations and spaces? Um, Also looking at who's doing some of this organizing work. Plug for Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action chapters across the United States. We have chapters in all 50 states, and so that's also another way to get involved. But then also calling your member of Congress, looking at the Build Back Better Act, looking at the Break the Cycle Act, looking at the George Floyd Act, and pushing your member of Congress as well to vote right on some of these substantial pieces of legislation, as well as background checks and ERPO, because these are all things that impact us at the national level.
Paul, what do you think?
No, I agree. I would say I think it's easy for folks to say, yeah, I want to do something. I would say educate yourself a little bit, attend some webinars, some panels, read up on the issue, and then get involved, volunteer, right? There's coalitions everywhere in every state that you can be a part of, and then just help to raise awareness around the issue, right? Sometimes it's not productive to, call your friends and family and start cussing people out of like, hey, you better vote this way. Or, sometimes it's more just a conversation, educate, and then folks tend to make a better decision once they're informed. So that would be my suggestion. But to Jose's point is there's a lot of efforts out there, a lot of groups. Moms Demand Action are awesome, that are advocating for. They're in the know on what's cooking in terms of legislation, and so it's easy to get plugged in if you're with the right group.
And Kelly, what do you think?
Completely echo everything that has already been shared. So one thing I'll add that we haven't really mentioned yet is the largest source of gun deaths in the country is from suicide. And we talked a lot about gun homicide because gun homicide does disproportionately fall on Latinos. But I think it's important too, one thing that a lot of people can do to prevent someone and their family from dying by gun suicide is to safely store their guns. And then if you have a child or if you go to someone's house, you can actually ask the question, is there a gun in the home? And if so, how is it stored? And it can feel really awkward, but because 60% of the gun deaths in the country come from suicides, it's really, really impactful, even though it seems like it won't really make that much of a difference or it's not something you see in the news a lot. And so definitely just think about guns that may be in your home or guns that may be in your family's home and talk about safe storage and talk about responsible gun ownership. And we actually have a program at Brady called In Family Fire, where we talk about how to do that because it's a huge issue. It cuts across racial categories and ethnic categories, even though a lot of times the news will make it sound like suicide doesn't affect Black and brown people. It does. And so it's a huge issue.
Another audience question I wanted to go to, and for all of you folks, of course. Of all the proposed laws to regulate firearms, which one do you think would make the biggest impact if it was adopted? Kelly, maybe we'll start with you. What do you think?
Well, since we're talking about regulating firearms specifically, because I do think the funding for community violence intervention programs is going to be huge. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and mention that. But to talk about firearms specifically, I think passing universal background checks would be huge. We know, obviously, it's not a silver bullet. There will be a lot of other things that we have to do, but it makes no sense right now that we live in a country where in some states you can get a gun off of the internet or you can get a gun from a private sale with no background check. That makes zero sense, and people have died because of it. So that's the law that I would say.
Paul, how about you?
I agree with Kelly. To be short with my answer, 100%.
Yeah, keeping up with this theme. Absolutely.
We got to find
Okay.
something to disagree on, Mark.
Well, we'll have to go to sports or something, I guess, next.
We can talk about the term Latinx.
We've got some time, so I'll go to another audience question. How does combating gun violence intersect with other movements such as justice-involved communities, transformative and restorative justice, prison reform, etc.? Why don't we start with you?
Who was it that you
Me?
wanted to start?
Oh, Jose.
Yeah, I think I think Paul could speak to the criminal justice reform work probably more in depth than I can. But I come from multiple different movement spaces, from education to sexual and reproductive rights to immigration rights work. And gun violence impacts all of these, right? Like gun violence is at the intersection of all of these different movements, whether it's education, where you have, obviously you had mass school shootings, but then also student resource officers and police officers in schools, potentially reinforcing the school to prison pipeline. You have, people who are trying to plan families, or people who are choosing not to have families that may not feel safe because they are going to an abortion clinic, or they are seeing counter protesters that are armed as well, but then also live in communities where they may not have access to the resources that they need in order for them to live whole and healthy lives. And so that also impacts the ways in which gun violence intersects with some of that work. And the list goes on, right? Like environmental justice, food insecurity, housing disparities. All of these are root cause factors to gun violence as well. And so if we're not addressing all of these at the same time with each other, and in these coalitions where we are being intersectional, then we're really not focusing on the bigger issue.
Paul, what do you think?
I like to use another term to complement what Jose shared. Right, we use called social determinants of health, right, which is everything that Jose mentioned. But I'm reading this book right now that a friend recommended called Political Determinants of Health, right, and so it tells a story about like this farmer who he takes over this land, and there's 3 trees, but one of them is kind of ugly and kind of drying up, so he just gets rid of it altogether. And then there's another one that is not as great as the third one, and then he kind of gives it some love, but he gives all his love to a nice, pretty one, right? And then over time, it's like, well, maybe he could have saved the one instead of throwing the first one away. And then it's like, well, the second one, even though it kind of wasn't that great, thrived and flourished. And it was like, what if he gave it the same attention that he gave the pretty one? And then so you start to look at it, and you're talking about black and brown people versus white people, and laws and systemic racism. And so it's conditions that and issues that kind of keep it as a cycle, right? Like we can't get out of it's hard for our people to get out of these issues because we're still kind of going in circles, because, right? Until we get to root causes of systemic racism and disinvestment in communities. I mean, Baltimore, I was just in Baltimore. I mean, my heart goes out to Baltimore and the difficulties that they have. They're total disinvestment. Everything else is honestly like surface level approaches until we get to like the root and the heart of what's really going on.
Kelly, your thoughts?
Yeah, and again, I totally agree. And just to kind of add another layer to it, I'm one thing that is implicit, but to make it explicit, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but we are all people. We are all human beings. We are not some other category. And so the fact that we see concentrated gun homicide oftentimes in Latino communities in inner cities, or Black communities in inner cities that have been disinvested in or over policed or underfunded, is not a coincidence. It's not about the people living there. They are just people in all of their complexity and everything, right? So we have to look at the conditions that cause it to happen, because we know that people are people. It's not that people living in the suburbs are better or white people are, no. So when we're looking at all of these historical and present factors that lead to gun violence, it's hugely important to think about it in terms of what does it mean when we live in a country where people oftentimes cannot afford health care, mental health care, for example. What does it mean we live in a country where people are afraid to call the police because they may be brutalized because of their immigration status? What does it mean when people can't necessarily vote their policies into place, or when the legislature doesn't represent the preferences of the majority of people because of racist structural factors? I mean, all of these things come to bear on the issues that we're seeing. And we started out this conversation talking about COVID and the gun violence that we've been seeing during this era, and how the same people who bore the brunt of the violence, or sorry, bore the brunt of the virus, have also borne the brunt of violence. And that's no coincidence. And so I love this question because it's getting at the heart of why we see gun violence acting the way that it does, because it's following paths of discrimination, it's following paths of oppression, and it's exacerbating all of them. And that impacts everyone in the whole country. And so I think it's really important to be thinking about it intersectionally. And there are a lot of ways to do that. I think Jose mentioned that I think all of our organizations will work in intersections with different groups for different issues. And so for people who want to get involved, or maybe are like, I want to do something about gun violence, but I also really care about the environment. Well, do your environmental work, because you actually will be helping gun violence there too.
And Kelly, I think you mentioned or alluded to some legislation in Congress that's there right now that can help curtail this. And I was wondering if you could expand on that and actually name that piece of legislation, just talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so there are several. Congress has, I should say the House has passed, for example, the Universal Background Check bill. It's sitting in the Senate. The House has also passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which doesn't seem like it has anything to do with gun violence, but it actually does. It's sitting in the Senate. So there are a variety of bills that deal with various aspects of gun violence, whether it's passing universal background checks or closing the Charleston loophole, that have passed in the House and are sitting in the Senate, awaiting the Senate to take them up and pass them. And that's why I mentioned some of the structural factors and issues that make it more difficult for us to tackle these issues.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're coming close to the end, so I just wanted to give you each just a little brief time to just wrap up a little bit of your thoughts overall. Jose, we'll start with you. Any lasting thoughts about that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think these discussions are important. Not only are they important, they're pivotal to really addressing this in our particular community, right? especially with the amount of stigma around mental health, with the amount of cultural realities and needs, the systemic barriers that happen. Oftentimes, we're not talking about gun violence, even though we live in spaces or come from spaces and communities that are impacted by gun violence in ways that we may not have processed yet. And so, I encourage each and every one of y'all who's out there listening, get involved, get engaged. If you're doing intersectional work, also think about the GVP lens as well. And we're really looking forward to making this movement more inclusive and really building a movement that's culturally relevant and understanding of our community's needs.
Thanks, Jose. Paul, 1 minute. Some lasting thoughts.
I would just encourage folks to build bridges in life, in work, in your family. Someone told me this recently, so I'll share it. And, if there's a person that you see a lot and you never interact with that person for whatever reason, just start to say hello, good morning, and kind of give folks a chance to be polite and spread some love on a basic level.
And Kelly, just 1 minute from you. Some thoughts to wrap up.
One thing I would just say is that we have momentum on this issue, and it can seem really bleak at times if you're someone who's engaged in gun violence prevention or cares about the issue or is just living in this country. But we are making progress on it, and we've alluded, for example, to the fact that the Biden administration has been trying to dedicate $5 billion to community violence intervention programs. And so there is a lot that we still can do in our states and our local communities. And so just keep up the fight and keep going and look for opportunities around you. Even in your community, it can make a huge difference on a local level. And there's a ton of momentum to make sure that we're reducing gun violence.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all. This has been fantastic. I personally could have been here all day, so really fascinating stuff. Thank you guys so much. To conclude, I just wanted to remind you of a few things. Please keep tweeting about the conference. That's hashtag CHCIHHM21. We have a full slate of sessions scheduled for tomorrow. Encourage everyone to attend as many sessions as you can throughout the day. If you know people who would be interested in the conference but haven't signed up yet, it's not too late. Encourage them to log in, register at chci.org, and they can attend the remaining sessions in the conference. And finally, for those of us that want to have some fun, please join our virtual 44th Annual Awards Gala celebration on Thursday evening, September 23rd from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And again, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you all.